If you're between the ages of 8 and 12 within the last 20 years, which is pretty much everybody born between 88 and 2012, chances are you've probably had at least a brush with Beyblade. This is another one of those series that, for me, the nostalgia hits really hard. I don't even really remember where it came from or how I had heard about it. It just seemed to appear one day. The earliest thing I can remember is having a VHS tape with an episode or two recorded onto it that I honestly watched way too much. It's been a long time since I've thought too much about Beyblade, and as I am to do with things, I've decided to take a look back and revisit those memories. I'm primarily going to be talking about the original series from the early 2000s, but don't worry, Metal Fight and Burst fans, I do plan to talk about other series eventually. Like most things coming out of the late 90s and early 2000s aimed at children, Beyblade was following in the footsteps of series attempting to replicate the astronomical success of Pokemon. But unlike most everything else that tried to do the same, Beyblade itself has seen an enduring sense of popularity. Sure, it may gradually fade away over time, but it always seems to come back a few years later, ready to take on the next generation of kids. The first products ever released came out in Japan in 1999 and were a Game Boy Color game and a few very plain looking Beyblades by today's standards. A manga was soon to follow, and within a year or so an anime was in full swing on TV. Pretty soon it was all over the place in Japan and was getting popular and successful enough for there to be interest in exporting it to the rest of the world. The series centers around Tyson, a young kid who loves Beyblade like any good toy anime protagonist should. He's apparently pretty tough stuff and is off to have a friendly match in another town to see just who the best really is. Unfortunately for him, the local Beyblade thug got there first and took everybody's Beyblades. Tyson resolves to get them back and sets up a match for the next day to do just that, giving him time to prepare and fall on his face a ton as a means of training, I guess. He keeps to his word though, like the shonen pro tag he is, but his victory is short-lived as he immediately comes up against the way too cool for school leader of the gang, Kai, who flaunts his own Beyblade, complete with his very own Bit Beast, a sort of fighting spirit residing in certain characters' Beyblades, leaning even more into that Pokemon Digimon territory. Tyson turns out to be no match for Kai as he decimates his Beyblade in short order. This works out well enough for Tyson though, because then he and his friends are able to band together and build him a new Beyblade, this time with the Dragoon Bit Beast residing inside his family heirloom sword deciding to enter its bit chip, and then Tyson has a Bit Beast of his very own. From there, Tyson goes on to meet new friends and rivals in a local tournament in the likes of Max and Ray. Oh, and of course, Kai is there too, brooding off in the corner. They all do well in said tournament because they're the main characters, and with the result being them forming a team that will go on to travel the world and compete for the World Beyblade Championship. Now, for myself, and I'm sure for most others who were kids at the time that lived outside of Japan, this show was my first exposure to the series. We never got most of the games that came out in Japan, and I didn't remember seeing the manga until much later after the series had ended, when my weeb phase was in full bloom. So the main marketing factor for the toys was the show, and oh boy, do I have a love-hate relationship with this show. Don't get me wrong, back when I was a kid, I ate every bit of this show up, licked the plate clean, and begged for more, and in a lot of ways, my inner child still adores this series. But there's also plenty of other things that, as an adult, are glaring enough that not even my most powerful of nostalgia goggles are able to block it out. The main and hardest thing for me to get past is the voice acting. Now, I don't want to drag these guys too much. They were just doing their jobs and worked with what they were directed to do. And when I think of these characters, theirs are the voices I hear. They're what I grew up with. But man, could none of these guys seem to yell in a recording booth. It's like some kid's voice acting demo that he uploaded to YouTube, but he's way too afraid to yell or be loud because he's worried his parents in the next room will hear him. It makes a lot of scenes that are supposed to be action-packed and intense just completely deflate. The localization process really doesn't help much either. To do this video, I actually went and watched the first 20 episodes or so in both Japanese and English just to compare, and it was really interesting going back and forth between them and noting what they changed and what they didn't. Certain things being removed I get, like Max being half American and Japanese and peppering his speech with a ton of superfluous English. Obviously that doesn't translate too well when your target audience already speaks English. Or this whole scene where they compare this kid's Beyblade to the drunken martial arts style and use alcohol and drunkard imagery. Very plain no-no in US kids TV. But other things like the fact that Tyson's mom died when he was younger are completely skipped over and not even mentioned in the English version. Sure, it's kind of implied given the fact that you never see Tyson's mom in the show and he only seems to have his grandpa as a parental figure, but the whole scene where his grandpa basically lays it flat out is completely removed. They didn't even try altering the dialogue, they just completely noped out of that plot line altogether. This one I don't get because is it sad? Yeah, sure, but this isn't exactly an uncommon thing, and wouldn't it be nice for the target audience of kids who might be in a similar situation to have that to relate to? It's even shown in the Japanese version that Max's mom isn't exactly in the picture either, and it's something the two somewhat relate over. There's also the issue of slipping in jokes into the dialogue where there weren't any originally, or adding lines when there weren't any before and really don't need to be.
Here's Kevin.
It just feels like the mindset is, oh, this is for kids, so it's gotta be funny, haha, all the time. Like, look, this is a show about spinning tops that bump into each other. The premise is already ridiculous enough. We don't need you undercutting any sort of dramatic tension the story tries to build with an out-of-place one-liner. These aren't uncommon issues for kids anime that were adapted at this time, and it's still better than the Duel Masters anime dub, but it's still strange, especially when most modern animated shows today, even in the Western world, really don't shy away from more mature topics that kids are likely to deal with. At the end of the day, I feel like I can confidently say that the English version does still get the same overall message across. It just does so without a lot of the nuance to the characters and dialogue that the Japanese version has. And yes, it does do a lot right, to the point that I don't think I could recommend the Japanese version over it and vice versa. The main thing is the way the tournaments are presented in English. This whole series is basically one long, giant tournament arc, and the additions brought into the English version I absolutely love. There's the Blader DJ, who's a sort of ring announcer present in both versions.
Here we go!
But the English version takes this a step further, adding in a play-by-play announcer and color commentator that are usually fairly entertaining, and I feel like add a lot to the battle scenes and kind of help sell the fantasy of this being a sport being broadcast on television.
Hello and welcome to Seaside Dome as we close in on today's main event.
To go along with it and to help sell that fantasy even more, whenever there's tournament matches, there's a little BBA watermark in the corner of the screen to make it feel like it's its own channel that you're watching it on. There's also infographics and stat screens for most of the characters, their Beyblades and Bit Beasts. There's also team names and logos for each of the groups they come across instead of just being referred to as the BBA team or the Chinese representatives. It does its job to help you buy into this world where Beyblading is a really big deal. Right along with it, and probably my personal favorite addition, is the music. In addition to the opening theme, the English version completely reworked the soundtrack to have a more higher energy rock vibe to it. And they also went a step further by doing a whole soundtrack's worth of their own insert songs, basically turning any scene with them into its own AMV.
Let it rip, get ready to fall. Never gonna take me down. Here comes the heavyweight generation Beyblade. Kids are doing it all across the nation. Time to battle now for world domination.
These are honestly the thing that stuck with me the most over the years, and I think what I'm most nostalgic for. Just hearing a bit of them and I immediately get rushed back to when I was a kid. In preparing this video, these songs actually ended up in regular rotation for me, and I am not at all complaining about that. I honestly can't tell if these songs are actually good or if I just have such a strong nostalgic connection to them that I would like them regardless of how good they are. But what I do know is that they add a ton of flavor and personality to the show and are much better to me than what I thought to be a pretty generic anime soundtrack in the Japanese version. And it does the same thing of being a way to further buy into this world where this toy they're selling is a really big deal. It'd be silly to say that Pokemon didn't have some sort of influence on the creation of Beyblade, especially within the context of the original series where there was such a heavy emphasis on the bit beasts inside the Beyblades. They were a bigger focus in the original Game Boy Color games where you'd collect multiple and they'd even have their own sort of evolution. But because the main focus was the toys, because they wrapped up what were essentially monster battles inside these battling tops, I think they were able to avoid a lot of the ripoff comparisons that came along with the likes of Digimon when it first came out. It also helps that the toys are just fun. The concept is immediately simple to grasp. You get a Beyblade, get with your friends and start launching them at each other, and you're gonna have a pretty good time. There's also the personalization aspect to them too, with them being tied to characters in the show and also incredibly customizable to where you can totally make them your own or be like me and just try to be Tyson IRL. It's no wonder these things have been regulars at schoolyards for the last 20 years. I even still have mine from the original series, some in better shape than others, and from the sequel series because when it came back, I was so excited to see Beyblades again that I jumped right back into it, even though I was entering my late teens at the time, and the girls I had crushes on were thrilled. I remember bringing them to school when I was a kid, and while researching for this video, I saw tons of comments online from kids and former kids who have done the same thing whenever each series was relevant. It kind of warms my heart to see those comments, seeing something that was such a big part of my childhood continue on in other kids' lives. I think what made the show work too, and what personally really sold me on the series, was the adventure fantasy in the show. You follow this team of kids traveling around to several real-world locations competing in a game that you could also go out and play with your friends, and I loved that. You see them each have their own personal growth as they go through their own challenges and also grow together as a team, and I think that's a really basic concept that will always work well. You want to see them come together, interact with each other, and overcome their adversities together. This aspect of the series was actually such a strong influence on me that when I flew out to LA for an anime convention and card game tournament late last year with a few friends, I honestly thought as I was getting on the plane, wow, this is just like Beyblade. Are my memories of these elements idealized? Yes, absolutely. My rewatching the show has made that painfully apparent. But it also doesn't negate my fondness for the series or the fun times I had launching tops at my friends when I was a kid. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Really appreciate you stopping by and sticking through to the end, like always. If you are like me and super have such a strong nostalgic connection to Beyblade, I'd love to hear your own personal stories. I'm still kind of bitter because I remember when I was in grade school, I was playing with one of my Beyblades like after class, and the school librarian took it from me, and it really upset me, and I was embarrassed to tell my mom about it. And also when I got pulled out of that school like a year or two later, I asked her if I could have it back and she just flat out told me no. God, I hated that woman. I honestly probably should just told my mom about it. But like I said, I was embarrassed to tell her that my Beyblade got taken away. But anyways, guys, if you like what I do here, please leave me a like. It really goes a long way in helping me out. And if you want to see more of what I do, subscribe and I'll be back probably in a couple weeks with something new, something nostalgic as well. So anyways, till next time.